The morning sun cast golden rays across Westminster Abbey as thousands gathered along the streets of London. Among the crowd stood families who had traveled from every corner of the United Kingdom, their faces filled with anticipation and emotion. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders, elderly couples held hands tightly, and veterans in their finest uniforms stood with pride. Inside the ancient walls of the Abbey, where monarchs had been crowned for nearly 1,000 years, Prince William prepared for one of the most significant moments in British history. The weight of tradition pressed upon his shoulders, but it was not the ceremonial robes or the crown that made his heart heavy. It was the absence that everyone felt, but few dared to speak about. As he stood before the ornate mirror in his preparation chamber, William's reflection showed a man transformed by years of service, loss, and growth. The young prince who once struggled with his royal duties had evolved into a leader ready to embrace his destiny. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his ceremonial attire, not from nervousness about the ceremony, but from the overwhelming realization of what this day represented. The doors to the Abbey began to open, and the first guests started to take their seats. Dignitaries from around the world, members of Parliament, and representatives from every Commonwealth nation filled the historic pews. But William's eyes searched for familiar faces among the crowd, seeking comfort in the presence of those who had supported him through his darkest hours. Catherine, radiant in her ceremonial gown, offered him a reassuring smile that spoke volumes. Their children, now old enough to understand the gravity of the occasion, stood with remarkable composure. George, Charlotte, and Louis represented not just the next generation of royals, but the hope and continuity of the monarchy itself. The Archbishop of Canterbury moved through his final preparations, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. The ceremony that was about to unfold had been refined over generations, each element carefully preserved to honor the sacred nature of the coronation. Yet everyone present knew that this particular ceremony would be different, marked by an emotional depth that transcended mere ritual. As the organ's majestic notes began to fill the Abbey, signaling the start of the procession, William took one final deep breath. The journey from prince to king was about to reach its culmination, but the path had been far from smooth. Years of public scrutiny, personal tragedy, and the constant pressure of royal expectations had shaped him into the man who now stood ready to serve his nation. The congregation rose as one, their collective breath creating a moment of profound silence before the music swelled. This was more than a coronation. It was a moment of national unity, a celebration of resilience, and a testament to the enduring power of the British monarchy to bring people together in times of both joy and sorrow. Outside the Abbey, millions more watched on television screens and mobile devices, their own emotions stirring as they witnessed history in the making. From hospital wards where patients paused their treatments to watch, to schools where children learned about their constitutional monarchy, the entire nation seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The ceremony was about to begin, but for William, this moment represented far more than the culmination of his royal training. It was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for the entire Commonwealth. The crown that would soon rest upon his head carried with it the hopes, dreams, and expectations of millions of people who looked to the monarchy for stability and inspiration in an uncertain world. The procession began with the sound of trumpets echoing through the ancient stone corridors. William walked with measured steps, his composure masking the storm of emotions swirling within him. Each footstep on the worn stones brought him closer to a destiny he had spent decades preparing for. Yet nothing could have truly prepared him for this moment. As he entered the main sanctuary of Westminster Abbey, a collective gasp arose from the congregation. The sight of the future king, resplendent in his ceremonial robes, walking beneath the soaring Gothic arches, created an image that would be etched in history books for generations to come. But it was not just his regal appearance that moved the crowd. It was the visible emotion on his face as he took in the magnitude of the occasion. Television cameras captured every nuance of his expression, and viewers around the world found themselves unexpectedly moved by the humanity they witnessed. This was not just a prince going through the motions of an ancient ceremony. This was a son, a husband, a father stepping into a role that would define the rest of his life and impact millions of people across the globe. The archbishop began the invocation, his voice carrying across the abbey with centuries of authority behind it. As the ancient words were spoken, William's eyes moved across the faces in the congregation. He saw his military colleagues from his service days, their uniforms a reminder of the young man he had once been, eager to serve his country in a different capacity. Their presence brought back memories of simpler times when his greatest concerns were mastering helicopter controls rather than navigating the complexities of constitutional monarchy. Among the dignitaries, he spotted representatives from the charities he had championed over the years. Their presence reminded him that kingship was not just about ceremony and tradition, but about service to those who needed it most. The homeless veterans he had worked with, the mental health advocates who had become his closest allies, and the environmental activists who had pushed him to take bold stances on climate change were all represented in spirit, if not in person. Catherine watched from her designated seat, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. She had witnessed William's transformation from a reluctant prince to an enthusiastic advocate for change, and now she was seeing him take the final step in that journey. Their children sat beside her, their young faces serious with concentration, as they tried to understand the historical significance of what they were witnessing. The ceremony continued with the presentation of the regalia, each piece carrying its own symbolism and weight of history. The orb representing the Christian world felt heavy in William's hands as he contemplated the spiritual responsibilities that came with his temporal power. The scepter, symbol of royal authority, reminded him of the delicate balance between leadership and service that would define his reign. But it was during the anointing that the true emotional weight of the moment became apparent. As the holy oil was applied, William's composure finally began to crack. The sacred nature of the ritual, combined with the realization that he was following in the footsteps of his grandmother, brought tears to his eyes that he no longer tried to hide. The congregation watched in respectful silence as their future king allowed himself this moment of vulnerability. It was a reminder that behind the pageantry and protocol was a human being taking on an almost impossible burden. The tears that rolled down his cheeks were not just his own. They seemed to represent the emotions of an entire nation processing years of change, loss, and hope. Television commentators struggled to find words to describe what they were witnessing. This was not the stuff of typical royal ceremonies, with their emphasis on stoic dignity and emotional restraint. This was something far more powerful and authentic, a genuine display of the weight of responsibility and the depth of commitment that William was bringing to his new role. The moment arrived when the archbishop lifted the St. Edward's crown, its jewels catching the light filtering through the abbey's stained glass windows. The weight of the crown was nothing compared to the weight of expectation and responsibility that William felt settling on his shoulders. As the ancient headpiece was lowered onto his head, time seemed to stand still. In that profound moment of coronation, something extraordinary happened in the abbey. A silence so complete descended that even the rustle of ceremonial robes seemed thunderous. Then, as if responding to some unspoken signal, the congregation began to weep. Not the polite, controlled tears typical of formal occasions, but genuine, heartfelt emotion that swept through the ancient building like a wave. William himself could no longer maintain his composure. As the crown settled into place, he thought of his grandmother, who had worn this same crown with such grace and dignity for over 70 years. He remembered her final words to him about duty, service, and the sacred trust between monarch and people. The memory of her steady hand on his shoulder during his most difficult moments brought fresh tears to his eyes. But it was not just grief that moved him and the congregation. It was the overwhelming sense of continuity, of being part of something far greater than any individual. The crown connected him to 1,000 years of history, to kings and queens who had faced wars, plagues, social upheaval, and change. He was now the latest link in that unbroken chain, carrying forward traditions while preparing to adapt them for a new era. Catherine watched her husband's transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. She knew better than anyone the private struggles he had endured, the sleepless nights spent worrying about whether he was worthy of the role destiny had chosen for him. Seeing him now, crowned and anointed, she felt a surge of admiration for the man who had grown from an uncertain young prince into a leader ready to guide his nation into the future. The children's reactions varied according to their ages and understanding. George, as the heir, seemed to grasp the gravity of what he was witnessing, perhaps recognizing his own future in his father's present moment. Charlotte watched with wide eyes, her natural composure matching the solemnity of the occasion. Louis, the youngest, seemed more affected by the emotional atmosphere than by any understanding of the ceremony's significance, but even he remained unusually still and quiet. Among the congregation, veterans who had served under multiple monarchs found themselves overwhelmed by the continuity they were witnessing. For them, the crown represented not just royal authority, but the stability and values they had spent their careers defending. Many had served in conflicts around the world, carrying the image of the crown as a symbol of the principles they fought to protect. The international dignitaries present began to understand something they had perhaps not fully appreciated before: the unique relationship between the British people and their monarchy. This was not mere ceremony or outdated tradition, but a living, breathing connection between past and future, between individual and nation, between the person wearing the crown and the millions who would look to him for leadership. As the formal proclamation of kingship was made, William's tears began to flow more freely. These were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude and determination. He thought of the countless people who had supported him throughout his life, from his military instructors who had taught him about service to the charity workers who had shown him the real meaning of compassion, to the ordinary citizens who had welcomed him into their communities and shared their hopes and fears. The ceremony continued, but something had fundamentally shifted in the abbey. What had begun as a formal state occasion had become something far more intimate and powerful. The barriers between monarch and subject, between ceremony and reality, seemed to dissolve in the face of shared emotion and common purpose. As the final prayers of the coronation ceremony were spoken, William found his voice for the first time since the crown had been placed upon his head. His oath of service, spoken in clear, steady tones despite his emotional state, resonated through the abbey with a power that surprised even him. Each word carried the weight of personal commitment and national promise, binding him to his people in ways that transcended mere constitutional duty. The congregation listened with rapt attention as their new king pledged to serve with his whole heart, to protect the vulnerable, and to uphold the values that had sustained the nation through its darkest hours. But it was the personal touches he added to the traditional words that truly moved those present. His promise to lead with humility, to learn from past mistakes, and to build bridges rather than walls spoke to a modern monarchy that understood its role in contemporary society. When the ceremony concluded and William turned to face his people, as their crowned king, the emotion in the abbey reached its crescendo. The applause that erupted was unlike anything heard in those sacred walls before, not the polite, measured clapping of formal occasions, but thunderous, heartfelt appreciation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient building. Catherine, approached her newly crowned husband, and their embrace in that moment captured something beautiful about love enduring through the most intense pressures. Their private moment, shared in full view of the world, reminded everyone present that at the heart of this grand ceremony was a family choosing to serve together. The children joined their parents, creating an image of royal family unity that would become one of the most iconic photographs in British history. Outside the Abbey, the crowds had been watching the ceremony on large screens erected throughout London. As news of the emotional scenes inside spread through the gathered masses, a remarkable thing happened. Strangers began embracing each other, sharing tissues, and finding comfort in their collective experience of witnessing something truly extraordinary. The British Reserve that was so famous around the world seemed to melt away in the face of genuine shared emotion. The procession from the Abbey back to Buckingham Palace took on a completely different character from the formal journey that had brought William there hours earlier. Now, as the newly crowned king, he rode in the gold state coach with a transformed demeanor. The weight of the crown was still there, but so was something new, a sense of purpose and connection that seemed to radiate from him to everyone who saw him pass. The crowds lining the route responded to this change in their new monarch. What had begun as respectful observation transformed into genuine celebration. People who had come simply to witness history found themselves emotionally invested in the success of the man they had just watched become their king. Cheers erupted, spontaneously, not because protocol demanded it, but because hearts had been moved. Television viewers around the world found themselves caught up in the emotion despite the distance. Social media platforms were flooded with messages from people who had not expected to be moved by what they had assumed would be merely a formal ceremony. The hashtags that trended spoke not of pomp and circumstance, but of hope, unity, and inspiration. The international media struggled to capture the full impact of what they had witnessed. Seasoned royal correspondents, accustomed to analyzing ceremonies in terms of political significance and historical precedent, found themselves instead trying to describe an emotional experience that transcended their usual frameworks of understanding. Back at Buckingham Palace, as William prepared for the traditional balcony appearance, he took a moment to gather himself. The crown still felt heavy on his head, but it was a different kind of weight now, not the burden of reluctant duty, but the satisfying heft of purpose accepted and responsibility embraced. He looked in the mirror one final time before stepping out to greet his people, and the man who looked back at him was fundamentally changed from the one who had entered Westminster Abbey that morning. The balcony appearance at Buckingham Palace had always been planned as the culmination of Coronation Day, but nobody could have predicted the extraordinary scene that unfolded when William stepped onto the famous balcony. The crowd gathered in. Front of the palace had swelled throughout the day, with people traveling from across the country just to be part of this historic moment. As the newly crowned king appeared, still wearing the crown that had been placed on his head just hours earlier, the roar from the crowd was deafening. But what happened next took everyone by surprise, including William himself. Instead of the traditional royal wave from a distance, he moved closer to the balcony's edge and began to speak, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, to the thousands gathered below. His words were simple but profound, thanking the people not just for their presence that day, but for their patience during his journey to kingship. He spoke of the lessons he had learned from ordinary citizens during his years of preparation, of the strength he had drawn from their resilience during difficult times, and of his determination to prove worthy of their trust. But it was when he spoke about his family that his voice began to break again. Catherine joined him on the balcony, and together they presented their children to the nation. William's voice was thick with emotion as he talked about wanting to build a country worthy of his children's future, a place where every child could have the opportunities that privilege had afforded his own family. The personal nature of his words, so different from the formal speeches usually associated with royal occasions, created an intimate connection with the crowd, despite the vast distance between balcony and street. The children themselves seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. George stood with remarkable composure for his age, perhaps beginning to comprehend that he was looking at his own future subjects. Charlotte waved with natural grace, her smile genuine and warm. Louis, despite his youth, seemed captivated by the sea of faces looking up at them, his own expression serious and thoughtful. But it was William's final gesture that created the moment that would be remembered forever. Removing the crown from his head, he held it aloft not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of the weight of responsibility he had accepted. The symbolism was clear. The crown belonged not to him personally, but to the people he served. In that gesture, he demonstrated an understanding of constitutional monarchy that his ancestors might not have possessed. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. What had begun as cheering transformed into something more akin to a collective sob of appreciation and recognition. People in the crowd began to realize they were witnessing not just a coronation, but the birth of a new kind of monarchy, one that acknowledged its dependence on popular support while maintaining its commitment to service above self. Television. Cameras captured faces in the crowd that told the story of a nation moved beyond expectation. An elderly veteran was seen wiping tears from his eyes as he saluted his new king. A young mother held her infant up toward the balcony, as if seeking a blessing for the next generation. Teenagers who had arrived skeptical of royal tradition found themselves swept up in the emotion of the moment. The international press corps, many of whom had come expecting to cover a routine ceremony, suddenly found themselves reporting on what felt like a watershed moment in British history. The live broadcasts captured not just the events of the day, but the palpable sense that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between crown and people. Inside the palace, staff members who had served the royal family for decades were visibly moved by what they had witnessed. Many had seen numerous royal occasions, but this was different. The emotion was genuine, the connection authentic, and the sense of new beginning tangible. They spoke quietly among themselves of feeling privileged to witness the emergence of a monarch who seemed to truly understand the modern role of kingship. As the balcony appearance concluded and the royal family retreated inside the palace, the crowd showed no signs of dispersing. Instead, they began to sing, their voices joining together in a spontaneous rendition of the national anthem that seemed to rise from the very streets of London and float up to the windows of Buckingham Palace, a final tribute to a day that had exceeded everyone's expectations. As evening fell over London, the immediate excitement of Coronation Day began to settle into something deeper and more lasting. Inside Buckingham Palace, William finally had a few moments alone to process what had happened. The crown sat on a nearby table, its jewels catching the soft light from the palace lamps, but it no longer seemed like a foreign object. It had become part of him, just as he had become part of the long line of monarchs who had worn it before him. The private family moments that followed the public ceremony were perhaps even more moving than what the world had witnessed. Catherine found her husband in quiet contemplation, still in his ceremonial robes but with a look of profound peace on his face. Their children, finally able to relax after hours of formal behavior, gathered around their father with a mixture of awe and familiarity that perfectly captured the dual nature of their lives. William knelt down to their level, the heavy robes pooling around him on the palace floor, and spoke to them not as a king to future subjects, but as a father to his children. He explained what the day had meant, not in terms of constitutional change, but in terms of family commitment to service. His words were simple enough for Louis to understand, yet profound enough to make George and Charlotte realize they had witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their lives. The international reaction continued to pour in throughout. The evening, with leaders from around the world commenting not just on the ceremony itself, but on the emotional authenticity they had witnessed. Messages spoke of being unexpectedly moved by the human dimension of what they had seen, of understanding for the first time the unique relationship between the British people and their constitutional monarchy. Social media platforms were flooded with personal stories from people who had watched the coronation and found themselves affected in ways they had not anticipated. Teachers wrote about showing the ceremony to their students and seeing young people engage with history in real time. Hospital patients spoke of finding hope and inspiration in William's words about service and commitment. Military personnel, both active and veteran, shared memories of serving under the crown, and their pride in seeing their new king demonstrate such genuine understanding of duty. But perhaps the most powerful responses came from ordinary citizens who had been present, either in Westminster Abbey or among the crowds in London. Their first-hand accounts spoke of feeling part of something larger than themselves, of witnessing genuine emotion in an age of manufactured experiences, of seeing their new king not as a distant figure but as someone who truly understood the weight of the responsibility he was accepting. The media analysis that followed in the days and weeks after the coronation consistently returned to the same themes: authenticity, emotion, and connection. Royal correspondents who had covered decades of ceremonies struggled to find comparisons for what they had witnessed. The coronation had broken the mold of royal events, creating something that felt both ancient and completely modern. William, himself, in the quiet hours after the public ceremonies had ended, reflected on the transformation he felt within himself. The reluctant prince, who had once questioned whether the monarchy had a place in the modern world, had become a king who understood that its future lay not in maintaining distance from the people, but in deepening the connection with them. As the last of the guests departed and the palace settled into quiet, William stood once more before the mirror where his day had begun. The man looking back at him was the same person who had awakened that morning, but something fundamental had changed. The crown had not just been placed on his head, it had somehow become part of who he was, and he had become worthy of it. The coronation of King William had lasted only a few hours, but its impact would be felt for generations. It had shown the world that the British monarchy could evolve while maintaining its essential character, that tradition and modernity could coexist, and that genuine emotion and authentic leadership could still move millions of people to tears, of joy and hope. In an age of cynicism and division, the coronation had provided a moment of unity and inspiration that reminded everyone of the power of shared values and common purpose. The crown now rested in its secure location, waiting for the next formal occasion when it would be needed. But the real coronation had taken place not in the placing of the crown, but in the moment when William had accepted, finally and completely, the role that had been his destiny from birth. In doing so, he had not just become king. He had shown his people what kingship could mean in the 21st century.